Okay, cool. So this is second episode of this series. And for this one, we are doing an excerpt of Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness, which is a paper by David Chalmers, probably the biggest name, I would say, in this debate. I mean, like, I maybe David Lewis or like Frank Jackson or something, but I mean, Chalmers is up there in terms of big names in philosophy and big names in this debate specifically.
Probably
And
Nagel too, because people always just bring him
oh,
up. Yeah.
for sure,
So
Nagel, yeah, for sure. This paper was published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, which is the premier paper or the premier journal for philosophy of mind. And it was published there in 1995. So this is, I mean, it's a little bit of an older paper, but I do think it was, I mean, from what we read, and I should say we are pretty much reading kind of the second half of the paper because it's where he puts the groundwork forth for his positive proposal for a theory of consciousness. I think Chalmers is maybe most famous, at least to people who are like, new to the debate. I think he's most famous for his criticisms of reductionistic theories, more so than he is for his positive proposals. I don't know if that's actually kind of what someone in the field would say, but from the perspective of someone outside the field, um, I do, that's what I know him from, at least. Um, yeah, so basically, we're going to be focusing on like, I think it's kind of interesting that it's an interesting experience. Like, I'm curious what you think of this, Mont. I feel like, as opposed to the first couple like discussions that we had, this time we're more just like jumping straight into I guess like the live issues in the field as opposed to, I feel like we ramped up a little bit last time to it and now
yes.
we're just diving right in.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I was thinking it might just be useful to very briefly say, uh, just tell people kind of like a little bit of motivation as to why Chalmers is at the point that he's at, in respect to what we're going to be discussing. Because basically Chalmers is he's famous for coining, what's known in this field as the hard problem of consciousness, which refers to the philosophical question of explaining why and how physical brain processes could give rise to subjective experience. And he makes this argument in a few different ways, which I'd be totally open to circling back to it if, kind of where we are, like in the debate, maybe like, impinges upon that. Um, but basically, Chalmers, in a variety of different methods, makes the argument really kind of along the same lines as Jackson makes his anti-physicalist argument that it's just kind of in plain speak, like it's just really not at all obvious why the totality of all of our kind of physical systems that we have, why and how that could give rise to consciousness. It's just not obvious. This is like his zombie argument. It's just not clear why I couldn't be exactly as I am physically, but just have no experience that goes along with my kind of physical constitution. And so that kind of rejection of reductionistic physicalist theories leads him in the second half of this paper, which we're going to discuss, to put forth his own candidate for a theory of consciousness, which he calls a non-reductive theory based on principles of structural coherence and organizational invariance and a double aspect view of information. Um, okay, so like introductory remarks aside, what did we do we want to do the rating for this?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
I Chalmers is a great writer. He's a great person to read, and he's a fun philosopher too. Like all of his papers and thought experiments and ideas are very fun. So in that sense, I thought this was a pleasure to read. I enjoyed it, I don't know, 8 out of 10. It's also very kind of like novel ideas. I feel like I'm very on board with like at least the principles that he puts forth, I feel like I'm very on board with. As with everything, so maybe I don't know, a 7 out of 10 in terms of how much I agree. In terms of my confidence in how much I agree, it's pretty low. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah. All right. I very much enjoyed the paper. Um, Probably like a 7 or an 8. I thought it was a good read, number one, but also two, like once you have the kind of the preamble, like the first few parts, read, then I feel like it's easy to circle back around for a reread just specifically on, like the positive tenets that he puts forward.
Hmm.
So I thought it was kind of an easy reread in that sense too, where it's like I don't actually have to read the first part again. So
Hmm. Hmm.
in terms of how much I actually agree, um, we'll get into this, but the dual aspect of information, I I'm not sure I fully understand that. And I think we'd have to read more about information, like some of the
Yes.
papers that he actually cites to um, maybe at least to drive that home for me. So I don't know actually how much I agree. I think the first two tenets, which we'll get into, I think is a little less controversial, as you said. Um, and my confidence is still like at an all-time low for any of this. So
Yeah, yeah,
I don't know. We'll talk about it. So
yeah. That's why I phrased what I said kind of specifically, where I said like I find what he's saying extremely plausible, but I'm in no position to say anything more than that. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
Giffin.
I I'm kind of where you guys are at. Like it was a good read. It was like a good writer, clear ideas. Um I enjoyed it around like a 7 or an 8. Um and then in terms of agreement, I'm probably like a little bit more on the skeptical side, closer to like a maybe I don't know, 5 or a 6 with like just all-time low confidence as Jordan put it. Um and most of that, as Adam mentioned, kind of just does relate to kind of like the last bit of like his of the positive theory. And also a part of like my kind of like grade does also relate to kind of the information. Like if I like had a more solid grasp about like information states and spaces and like how that like maps onto like reality as we know it in the physical world, like I might have a more like greater confidence in it because I think I understand it, but that's saying so little, frankly. So, yeah, again, like the bounds of like kind of information felt like similar to like what we discussed last week, where like the bounds of like what knowledge is, like that kind of conversation was like space where like beyond which I was like a little uncertain, and similar this week. There were just things that like I would love to explore more or understand more. But yeah, no, I mean it was a good read, clean read. Um, and yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of picking apart some of the bits because honestly, the best part about like the discussions is almost always like looking to make sure that we're all on the same page, or maybe there's a richness
Mhm.
here that like kind of ignored on the first read.
Yeah, most certainly. Most certainly.
And I will
The only
confess, because of my schedule, I kind of read this entirely today. So I
No,
didn't
that's
have
that's
fine.
I
That's
didn't
fine.
have the chance to like truly like digest it. Last week I did more of that. This week I did not.
No, that's
just
fine. That's
kicking
fine.
Giffin off the call now.
Yeah.
And calling the police.
The only thing I was going to add to what you said, Giffen,
Yeah.
was like I felt that same way about the kind of like questions that we had about knowledge last time, but they were actually only kind of like redoubled for me with respect to information because knowledge, I don't like think knowledge is like a metaphysical thing. Like it's just kind of it's really like a linguistic debate. Like, you know what I mean? Do you have to like meet certain like knowledge isn't anything outside of like what we want to call it, but I don't know that that is true. Like information could be much more metaphysically heavy than
Yeah,
that.
there's
So
it relates a little bit to like modern like neurophysics
mhm.
and mathematics almost in like the in
Yeah.
ways that like
Mhm.
it was testing my bounds for sure.
Yeah, I was when I was reading that section, I'm just like, okay, this is something that I've just got to talk with like both of you about because I feel like I'm the lowest on the totem pole as far as like it comes to understanding that kind of stuff specifically. Like I don't have any really, intricate background in that area where like Adam might have the best of the three of us. just given like
I'd endorse that.
your coding experience and I don't know, like software. I don't know.
Yeah, I
I
have
mean,
I marked a specific place where I'm like, I want to see if like Adam's
yeah,
code brain like develops an interesting perspective here, or can
Yeah,
shed
yeah.
we'll
light.
see. We'll see.
But okay, so I don't think that section six is going to require too much in terms of discussion because I mean it is. I mean he's getting on the table kind of some remarks that he's going to put forth a non-reductive explanation. Um, and for people who might not know, if you're putting forward a non-reductive explanation, all that that means is that it can't be, I was going to say reduced, but I'm going to try to give an account that doesn't use the word in it. If you're putting forth a non-reductive explanation, it just basically means that like, okay, the thing that you're talking about can't be broken apart wholly in terms of more simple um, pieces or concepts. So basically, like he gives this example, but we think that something like electromagnetism is non-reductive. So we can't talk about electromagnetism in terms of simpler components where we can, like Newtonian mechanics is something that is like fully reducible into, we can talk about like the motion of a ball being thrown in wholly reductionistic terms. Um, so I think that's one thing to kind of get on the table. And he's going to posit, I guess, these kind of fundamental, I guess he's going to posit a fundamental property that will then require fundamental laws to go along with it. And I, he puts this forth as being a very quasi-scientific endeavor. I mean, I don't know that much about like the history of science, but it does seem like this is a very, and he draws analogies to like this is kind of how physics progressed, where we have unexplained phenomenon, and the way that we've kind of gone about theorizing about it is that we will posit a fundamental principle or a fundamental entity, and then kind of like see what we get from that in terms of explanation, in terms of coherence, in terms of making sense of existing phenomenon as we are able to observe it. So he's trying to kind of take the same plan and apply it to a theory of consciousness. He's viewing it as okay, current reductionistic physicalist theories are unsatisfying. Therefore, we're going to approach this more like a physicist and posit, a few or maybe one fundamental principles or fundamental entities, and then kind of move forward and see how well that explains the datum that we have. Is that how you guys were seeing his argument as well?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note he does kind of bring up two examples to juxtapose. In both examples, like the kind of ontology of all things to be explained was kind of expanded in a sense. Like,
Mm,
in one sense, the first example, like the vitalists, kind of imagining there was some sort of, vital spirit to living
mm,
organisms that was proposed because they believed that, you know, all physical processes could not explain life in some way. So that was actually an error
mhm,
that was proposed, to kind of expand the ontology of, both physical processes and life, when in reality, life can be reduced to mere physical processes.
mm,
But then in the second example, as you're alluding to, or as you said explicitly, which is like electromagnetism in Maxwell's equations, it's like, okay, well, that was actually a valid
mhm.
kind of
Expansion.
expansion of
Yeah.
ontology there, where it's like actually electromagnetism doesn't just reduce to Newtonian physics.
Mhm,
Like that's not an
mhm.
accurate thing. So it was valid there, it was invalid in the previous example. So in this case, he's arguing that this expansion would be valid. So
Yeah. So he states explicitly, I suggest that a theory of consciousness should take experience as fundamental, We know that a theory of consciousness requires the addition of something fundamental to our ontology, as everything in physical theory is compatible with the absence of consciousness. Like I said, that second part is a result of his kind of, I don't know, other realm of argument that we're not discussing here, but we're kind of like, you could take, given that he believes this, he believes that um, physical reductionist explanations are not sufficient. We're going to then move forward and posit experience as fundamental. I mean, it's kind of interesting. There is that like the middle paragraph on 15 where he does kind of like he notes briefly that this position qualifies as a variety of dualism, which is kind of interesting. I mean, he calls it like a naturalistic dualism.
Yeah.
Is it it's dualist just in the sense that he's saying that experience is fundamental. So I guess naturalistic dualism is going to be different from supernaturalistic dualism in the sense that like it's hard to know exactly like what the difference between those two is, but is it naturalistic in the sense that while experience on this theory is going to be kind of a fundamental entity, it does conform with laws that are themselves kind of connected and bound by the physical?
Yeah.
Is
Can
that
you
why?
Yeah,
read
Yeah.
like that
yeah, I
last?
would say.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say like we can just read like the last sentence or two of that paragraph,
Mm,
where he lays out what naturalistic is in this view.
mm,
If you'd like, I can just read that.
Yeah,
mhm.
go ahead.
So it says, indeed, the overall structure of this position is entirely naturalistic, allowing that ultimately the universe comes down to a network of basic entities obeying simple laws, and allowing that there may ultimately be a theory of consciousness cast in terms of such laws.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly like enjoyed the casting of this like his theory as like not involving like voodoo or anything, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
in terms of like I can't imagine how many like supernaturalistic duelists are there, like self-avowed supernaturalistic duelists are there. Because I'm
It
A
not
lot
really
of
has
sure
to
I like
be.
recall the
Well, yeah. 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 Most in America.
I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that this is like a probably implicit, like moving away from religious explanations. I mean,
Okay. That makes sense.
supernaturalism,
I'm not
yeah, it
sure if I
has to.
understood like that context fully. I guess I assumed he was in dialogue with like, another
Mhm.
sect of the philosophy untethered from religion. But if that's like the main thrust, then understood.
Or even just like, I mean, philosophers who were explicitly influenced by religion on this, like I'm thinking of like Descartes. I would think that
Yeah.
his dualism, at least in this framing, wouldn't qualify as naturalistic
Okay.
dualism because it doesn't seem. I mean, I don't really remember that much about it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I don't
from
remember the
what
other dualisms at all, so that's I was just kind of curious. But it's not a
it
huge deal.
doesn't, if, at least from what I read, I don't know if maybe kind of in some back corner pocket of like Descartes' theory it is, but I don't remember anything about like the emphasis on being kind of bound by fundamental laws, especially of like the connection with the way that physical matter and information is constrained, that playing a role in like, the constraining of consciousness too. I don't remember that being present in Descartes'
Oh,
dualism.
that's a
Yeah,
great
so
point, actually.
yeah, so I think that that's where he's really emphasizing like I am positing a fundamental principle, and in the sense that it's irreducible in terms of physical terms, it's going to become kind of like a dualism. But like, it's okay because I'm not pulling a Descartes here. I'm going naturalistic dualism. He's not going
That's actually
full
a great that's a great explanation, Jordan. I appreciate that.
if it's correct. It's a good explanation of Descartes' theory.
All with a grain of salt.
Yeah, always. Um, Okay, so do we want to get to section seven then, the outlining the positive proposal of the theory of consciousness? Because this is where the meat is, really. I
Yeah.
Yeah,
mean,
I
I
didn't
think
have any
it's, yeah,
major notes before
yeah.
that.
I think that there was, I liked, his he does motivate this section in a really compelling way to me, at least, where he does just kind of point out like, one thing that makes this domain difficult and slippery is the paucity of objective data,
Mhm.
to use his framing.
Yes.
He just and it's just true. I mean, conscious experience, I'm quoting now, is not directly observable in an experimental context. So we cannot generate data about the relationship between physical processes and experience at will. And he's just like, you know what? Yeah, this is like it's the hardest thing to study. It just is. I mean,
I actually loved how he laid it out here so simply and like in a way that we kind of like anticipated it in our discussions last week. Like I really
mhm,
appreciated just like laying it down, just stating it straightforwardly in ways
yep.
that were like intuitive, but also like rang true.
hmm And he said, I think this was in the previous section, but like, because of a lot of these concerns, we're going to have to apply to broadly scientific values that we hold. And those are going to have to play a pretty big role in our, evaluation of this theory. We're going to have to apply to things like coherence, to simplicity, to quality of explanation for existing phenomenon that we're aware of.
Yeah, that was actually a point that I wanted to kind of address. So this is we're looking at the
Okay.
bottom of 16 here, right?
hmm
Sort of
Oh,
the
there we
bottom.
go. Yeah. Yeah.
Finally,
Yeah.
the fact that we are searching for a fundamental theory means that we can appeal to such non-empirical constraints as simplicity, homogeneity, and the like in developing a theory. And I think he talked about a few more. I don't know, like I don't know if it's like the history or the historiography of science that's kind of like lacking in my head. I'm not sure, like I'm not sure, like to what extent like that sentence rings completely true. Like the fact that we are searching for a fundamental theory means that we can appeal to simplicity, homogeneity. Like I'm not sure like I fully grasp what he was like saying there.
Well, in terms of like kind of take it word by word, but we see that we're unaware of the direct ancestor of these six species, right? Five of them share a certain trait in common, and the sixth does not share that trait. Okay, so one hypothesis is that the five independently developed this trait and the sixth didn't, or actually the common ancestor had this trait and then inherited that to all six species, but it was in fact lost in one of the species. What is the more
No,
simplistic hypothesis there? It's
no,
like Occam's razor would say, like actually, it was simply lost in one of the species. It wasn't developed independently five times.
yeah,
Like that would be the kind of the simplicity aspect there. Um,
okay.
You
No,
Probably
know
a
that
what's
better,
that actually is a
interesting?
great
yeah.
You,
example.
you know, you know what's interesting in terms of Giffin's question, though, is it's interesting because obviously I agree with everything you said. The way that Chalmers does frame that sentence is kind of interesting because he almost seems to say like, well, he does say, okay, so the fact that we are searching for a fundamental theory means that we can appeal to these constraints. If I understand you correctly, like the evolutionary theory in biology is not positing any fundamental theories, yet it is still appealing to like
That's
these
exactly
concerns.
the
So I
way.
do
Yeah,
I kind of see like Giffin's question is like what okay, it it's weird because it aren't these I mean this is such like a nitpicky point, but like these isn't it kind of like completely orthogonal to whether it's a fundamental theory that we would want to
yeah. He emphasizes fundamental. Jordan, that's exactly kind of the tension I was bringing up. Because Adam, you did a great job outlining like the simplicity kind of like Occam's razor line of thinking, but I just don't know like if it's is it the search for a fundamental theory that like allows us to do like look at that, or is
or
this more
maybe
like
it's
a
just like even more important is maybe what
yeah
he's saying.
that
Like,
seems like a little more reasonable. Just like hey, like we kind of lack some of the tools in the tool belt that we normally would have, so we're kind
yeah,
of just gonna have to use these. But like that's not kind of like the framing he uses. So um
because I take it like with just the development of evolutionary theory, it was and has continued to work from non-controversial fundamental principles and has tried to develop like an explanation of current data in the most parsimonious manner And maybe Chalmers is just saying because like we don't even have that much to work with here, then the emphasis is even more so on like these kind of broadly
Yeah,
scientific principles.
I think so. I just think that kind of underlying like many of the ways that we look at the world, like we're kind of drawing upon kind of fundamental principles.
Mm-hmm.
So he's saying like, okay, like in the context of a fundamental theory, like as you said, we in many ways lack the actual hard data, but we can
Mm.
still draw upon these fundamental principles that we kind of analyze the world. So
Okay. And if it's just like reframing, like, hey, remember these intuitions still exist, even if we lack the kind of like the other things, then I'm on board. That's like totally fine.
Hmm.
I did kind of like put a question mark next to that though at first.
I agree with that framing or like the explicit kind of statement that he makes is a little weird, but
Yeah.
because I can imagine instead of like a fundamental theory, like a higher level theory in other disciplines, where in fact, like appealing to simplicity might not actually be
mm,
a fair thing to appeal to once there is hard data on the table.
mm.
Like I don't know, what's a good example for that?
Oh no, I was just gonna say actually I was thinking that the example you used earlier, Adam, was good too, where like earlier it was posited there was kind of like a fundamental simple property that explained life, whereas we actually know that that's not needed. And so even though the explanation that we currently endorse is far more complicated than a simple principle, it's still the like accepted one because it appeals to so many other um, values better.
Exactly. So it's like
Yeah.
simplicity is favored except in with kind of the
Yes.
addition of like data that now
Hmm.
contradicts.
I
So
think I think I think the Latin is pro tanto then for that, so it's valued to the extent that like to all other things being equal, if one theory is more simplistic than the other, then that is a sort of pro tanto reason to the extent that that is secured by that theory. It's like valued by that or something
That,
like that.
that makes sense. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And Adam, I do appreciate the examples that you're giving. Those are pretty concrete.
cool.
Um, okay.
Um, a non-reductive theory of consciousness will consist in a number of psychophysical principles, principles connecting the properties of physical processes to the properties of experience. We can think of these principles as encapsulating the way in which experience arises from the physical. Ultimately, these principles should tell us what sort of physical systems will have associated experiences, and for the systems that do, they should tell us what sort of physical properties are relevant to the emergence of experience, and just what sort of experience we should expect any given physical system to yield. A tall order, no reason why
Hmm.
we should not get started. And then he's the introducing like the three specifics.
Hmm.
In what follows, I present my own candidates for psychophysical principles that might go into a theory of consciousness. The first two are non-basic principles, systematic connections between processing and experience at a relatively high level. Um, the principles can play a significant role in the development. Um, actually, there's a smudge on my page. I can't really read what that says. In
In
developing,
developing, yeah,
in developing something.
and constraining.
Here,
Thank you.
I'll read I'll
Foolishness.
read these two.
Please just go.
The first two of these are non-basic principles, systematic connections between processing and experience at a relatively high level. These principles can play a significant role in developing and constraining a theory of consciousness, but they are not cast at a sufficiently fundamental level to qualify as truly basic laws. Okay, so you're right, Giffin. Being fundamental and being non-basic seem to be synonymous. Continuing. The final principle is my candidate for a basic principle that might form the cornerstone of a fundamental theory of consciousness. This final principle is particularly speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that is required if we are ever to have a satisfying theory of consciousness. Okay.
Yeah. So we can.
So, yeah.
Yes, that seemed
He's,
like roughly correct. I'm
yep.
not sure. There still
Yep.
seems to be kind of like a lot of like similar language that's tossed around, and it's unclear if there's a distinction between like basic laws, basic principles,
Hmm.
basics, not 100% sure. But at least he distinguishes
Yeah.
the third point from his first two
Yeah. Yeah.
points. And
Okay,
it's kind of
so
odd to me that like the I'm sorry, Jordan. I just want to
no,
mention
no,
like
no,
that
I'm
the
sorry. Go ahead.
basic comes last, and I'm not sure like
Yeah.
what reasoning that is that it comes last because it seems like it should like the basic
It's
should
more
inform like the
speculative.
upper. But yeah,
I think
it
that's
is
why it
more
comes last.
it is more speculative. So maybe that's it's as simple as that. Yeah. Anyways, Jordan, you can we can keep going after you finish.
Okay. I'm just trying to keep like a check here. So far, the things that we've been asked to take on board are that consciousness is non-reducible. And because it's non-reducible, here's what we're going to do. We're going to posit a few groundwork principles, one of which is going to be kind of like a fundamental principle. It's kind of going to be a law of nature for consciousness in that sense of being fundamental. Does that seem right?
I kind of like I kind of have the opposite intuition, which is like the first two principles are more so like laws, where the third is actually kind of the bedrock of the theory, which like
Interesting.
it's like because like laws are like physical laws are really just descriptions of how the universe works, right? Like
Mm,
they don't really explain anything. They're really just descriptions. And I think that's what
mm,
the first two principles are, where they're just like, okay, these are just descriptions of what we observe.
mhm.
So any good theory should take into account these quote unquote laws in a sense. The same way as like, any physical theory we have,
Sure.
it's just a body of
Mhm,
facts, but on top of that, like observations,
mhm,
so but there are kind of like there's a bedrock of any physical theory too, which
mhm,
is,
mhm.
I mean, Giffin, what would you say is the bedrock of biology? So
The bedrock of biology is just chemistry and physics.
I
But
I,
like
I also but it's also true that like like there are certainly biological laws too.
Mm,
Um, you know,
yeah,
I
I'm
go ahead.
no, I was gonna say like one of the things that's kind of like uncertain to me about like applying scientific knowledge, especially in some of the softer areas to like this context, is like he like Chalmers kind of references kind of mostly physics. And it seems like that's kind of like because so like in tying like at least the third point that he makes, like that's kind of like it can't be analogous to biology in a way, if you would agree with
mm.
that. And I guess if your question is about like the first 2 points, like what would be an analogous biological thing? Um, that's a tough question. It's like so abstracted from like the basic that I'm not sure if there's like a direct applicable comparison.
We
I,
won't worry. I mean,
I
there's
was
laws of
imagining
genetics and stuff like that. Just general things we observe that
like yeah, Mendelian inheritance or
yeah,
something.
like exactly like
Mm.
that.
Like
That's
we have a Punnett square and we like for all these traits we can just like observe like put the Punnett square together and see like the distribution of offspring's traits, something like
Mhm,
that.
and the thing about that is it doesn't actually explain too much. It
mhm,
just is an observation
Yeah.
on how things
mhm,
actually work.
mhm.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I view that very similar to like the first two principles here, which is just
Okay.
like, yeah. So,
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
That's cool. Yeah. Hopefully that was an adequate answer to your question, Adam.
sure.
Um
Yeah. I'm trying to keep in mind like the status of like what we're signing up for essentially, if that kind of makes sense. Like, um, yeah.
yeah.
So,
So Adam, I like the way you described it. Like these are like descriptions that like we can use kind of an as a framing if we're like if we are to have like a fundamental principle, it needs to describe these.
Yes, it has to
mhm,
because
And
it's like it.
these we
Yeah,
can like even if we lack the kind of objective data, these are at least things that we can all like potentially
mhm.
all look at and from our own experience or what have you and say, okay, that is a descriptor of the world for which we can like find something fundamental to describe it, right?
exactly. It's the same thing with like Newtonian laws, where it's like Newtonian laws are just a description of, on a very high level, how matter kind of
Yeah. Like
interacts.
the
Like,
observation of a
yeah,
bowling ball falling at a certain rate is like a
Mm.
law. And then
yeah,
like the fundamental forces that underlie like that, I don't know, it would be a combination of I guess the gravity is kind of a fundamental
Yeah.
force, So I don't know if I can find a perfect analog, but
But
like
there's
Mhm.
like but like okay, but like Einstein's theory of like general relativity
yeah.
has to take into account like it
Mhm.
has to explain Newtonian laws. Like, you know
Yes, it
what I
had to
mean?
explain the
Like it
bowling ball falling at a certain rate.
yeah, it has to explain them. And it's the same way with like these principles where it's like I like where he says once again, I think you already read it, but in developing and constraining, where it's like anything I
Mhm.
propose here has
That's
to
too. Yep.
explain the first two principles, which is like something we kind of observed. So let's
Hmm.
get these on the table.
Yep.
I'm gonna take these as kind of like in a sense laws to be explained, and then like the third thing is like, well, here's kind of the bedrock of the theory. Here's
Hmm.
the explanation part. Like,
Yeah,
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
yeah.
that makes a lot of
No, that
sense.
actually, no, that's actually
Thank you,
quite.
Adam.
Okay, let's talk about the two non-basic principles and then we'll move to the basic. Okay, so the first one is called the principle of structural coherence. I'm just going to read the first paragraph essentially.
Yeah.
Um, okay. This is a principle of coherence between the structure of consciousness and the structure of awareness. Recall that awareness was used earlier to refer to the various functional phenomena that are associated with consciousness. I'm now using it to refer to a somewhat more specific process in the cognitive underpinnings of experience. In particular, the contents of awareness are to be understood as those information contents that are accessible to central systems and brought to bear in a widespread way in the control of behavior. Briefly put, we can think of awareness as direct availability for global control. To a first approximation, the contents of awareness are the contents that are directly accessible and potentially reportable, at least in a language using system. Okay, so that is not obvious at first read what he's saying there, but
Yes.
the way that I am understanding this, so to use an example, if you are so if you're aware of something, so for instance, I can be aware of my breath, but not aware of something like the growth of like my hair follicles. Does that mesh with how you guys are understanding the difference between something of which you can be aware and something of which you cannot be aware? Because
That's
he's saying
exactly how
like,
I interpret it. Because I think like, you know,
okay,
we've got, you know, all of our sensory perception. It's like
hmm
all of that is being transmitted to some central location, which is our brain in our, you know, in our case
hmm
specifically, versus like, you know, cellular activity that you're talking about. Like you're not available, you know, you're not
yeah,
privy to what's going on there because all the information contents of what's happening within the cell that's actually not being transmitted up to the brain for
yes,
global control and access at that point versus like
hmm
touching this table. It's like you can trace the
hmm
exact signals that are then kind of being transmitted to the brain. So there's like kind of a global
hmm
aspect to that information. You're made aware of it. So
hmm
yeah,
hmm
Yeah.
yeah.
and I think one thing that threw me off originally when reading it, but that makes sense now, is that so if you are aware of something, you have it's directly available for global control, not in the sense that you can control it, but in the sense that it is sort of consciously accessible. Like you can kind of like it's hard to put into words, but like experientially it shows up in some sense. And I think he kind of clarifies this later in the next paragraph because he says, wherever we find consciousness, we find awareness. So if you, so you cannot be conscious of something without being aware of it, which makes sense. That checks out.
Yeah.
Um, and he says, wherever there is conscious experience, there is some corresponding information in the cognitive system that is available in the control of behavior and available for verbal report, which makes sense. Like you have to be able to, if you're aware of something, at least theoretically, you it has to be available to be reported. Like it has to be reportable. You can't. Um, so
Yeah.
I
Can
think
we?
like
I have
bodily
a question.
sensations. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
No, no. You can continue your example. It might answer the question. Bodily sensations.
I was just gonna say like okay, like any bodily sensation is something that you have awareness of because it is available to be reported. Um, and if you don't have a bodily sensation of it, for instance, like I said, the growth of like a hair follicle, that is something for which you don't have awareness because you can't, there's no way in which you can consciously access um, that change going on, right? What was your question, Giffen?
So I guess my question related to the phrase, like, so there is some corresponding information in the cognitive system that is available in the control of behavior. I'm not sure if I fully understand what available in the control of behavior means. So the example that we were using right now is like breath versus hair follicle growth or something like
Mm-hmm.
that effect, where like I can like, I can control breath, like my
Mm-hmm.
own breathing, but I cannot control like hair follicle movement. Um, is that like awareness is only like kind of a self-assessing thing? Like, can I be aware of like a table across the room? And what way does that interface with like the control of behavior?
I, the way I'm reading it is when he says there is some corresponding information in the cognitive system that is available in the control of behavior. I think he's not saying that you can control the thing that you are aware of, but that the information contained in the thing that you are aware of can be used to bear upon the control of behavior in the same way that it can be available for verbal report.
Okay. I
So,
understand
I
like the
think that's
verbal
accurate.
report element.
Yeah.
That okay.
mhm. So in the sense that if I am aware, to use your example, Giffen, like if I am aware that there is a table there, I can't control anything about the location of the table, or I can't like, directly control that. But it is information that shows up in my awareness. And what it means to show up in my awareness is that it's available to play a role in the control of my behavior.
So like so you can avoid it like smacking into your shin. Like that would
Yes.
be
It's
Yes,
okay.
exactly. It's exactly
Understood
right.
yes,
fully.
Exactly right.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think just a quick clarification, it's not even that you can successfully use it to control your behavior, but that it shows up as something which could potentially bear on the control of your behavior. So for
Right.
instance, like if you're like you're actively like falling into the table and you like, you notice that like you are like, God damn, I'm falling into the table. It's not that you have to successfully be able to avoid it, but in that moment, that information is available to bear on the control of your behavior.
Perfect
Yeah, I think
explanation.
like the easiest way to kind of solidify this too is like imagining two situations where one person's blind and another person's not. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just like, the person who has sight sees the table and it's like, okay, those information contents of just, you know, light processing and then, pretty much creating some sort of abstract conception of the table. It's like
Yeah.
there's no guarantee one way or another that you're gonna like bump into the table or not bump into the table, but at the same time, the information is there for
Yeah.
the potential that it could in fact influence behavior
Yeah.
versus like a blind person, like there's no way that that's going to have any control over their behavior if they're not in fact like perceiving or they're not conscious of the table.
But if they
So
had a walking stick and they felt something bump into it, that would
yes,
create
yes,
information that is
Mm-hmm.
it's
available, even if it can't
precisely,
prevent their falling. If okay.
precisely,
So
precisely.
thank you
Yeah,
for that explanation. That actually makes a lot of sense. The verbal report like made sense entirely, but yeah, okay, cool.
yeah. I think we're
Just
all on board with that.
Yeah, I think we
So
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I'm just going to check out this. He gives the contrapositive. He says, conversely, it seems that whenever information is available for report and for global control, there is a corresponding conscious experience. Yeah, that 100% checks out. You can't have something be available in this sense um, for report and for global control that doesn't have a conscious experience along with it. Even, I mean, I would think like the conscious experience could be quite dim, right? I mean, something like your peripheral vision, like that is clearly available for um, report and global control, but it just plays a very dim role in consciousness,
Yeah, it is
right?
non-zero presence, but like not like pain is like very forward or something to that effect. Like
Yeah.
experiencing
Yeah.
pain.
hmm
Yeah,
hmm
that makes sense to me.
In the middle of page 19 is when he actually spells out the principle itself. He says it is this isomorphism between the structure of consciousness and awareness that constitutes the principle of structural coherence. This principle reflects the central fact that even though cognitive processes do not conceptually entail facts about conscious experience, consciousness and cognition do not float free of one another, but cohere in an intimate way. Do we want to move to the second principle?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we got the first
Oh, actually,
principle kind of nailed
let me read this last part right here, which I think
down.
relates to what we just said there, which is empirical investigation might lead us to to better understand the structure of awareness within a bat, shedding indirect light on Nagel's vexing question of what it is like to be a bat. So, like, he's assuming the bat is conscious, right? Like that's already an
Yeah.
assumption right there.
Mhm.
But given the information contents that we know the bat is now aware of and how
Mhm.
those information contents are processed, we can assume some things about the bat's kind of experience in general. So,
And importantly, I think, with respect to last episode, he's admitting that the physical understanding is a heuristic to better understand the experiential. It doesn't give direct. It's more of
yes,
like it's the inferential knowledge that we were talking about. Yeah.
it all comes back to like with the bat, where it's like, uh, it's what do they use? Echolocation. Is that the name
hmm
of it?
Yeah.
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 So so it's like, okay, that's another way that they're receiving information contents. Given everything we just talked about, is it a safe assumption that the bat in some way um, incorporates the processing of those information contents, and that results in some experience associated with that, or is there's the processing of those information contents and there's additional experience associated with that? I think the former we'd have to assume.
Yes.
So
Yes. No, that was actually good. I'm glad you read that. Okay. Second principle. This is the second non-basic one. This is the principle of organizational invariance. So I'll just read the beginning of the first uh, paragraph that introduces it. This principle states that any two systems with the same fine-grained functional organization will have qualitatively identical experiences. If the causal patterns of neural organization were duplicated in silicon, for example, with a silicon chip for every neuron and the same patterns of interaction, then the same experiences would arise. According to this principle, what matters for the emergence of experience is not the specific physical makeup of a system, but the abstract pattern of causal interaction between its components. And I think this has come to be known as substrate independence, the principle of substrate independence in the philosophy of mind. But basically, I mean, in summary, is this principle states that it is the causally functional organization that matters, not the uh, substance or substrate that the system is made out of. Insofar as you can get the same, you can't make it out of like, it can't just be like, just pudding. It's got to have like the ability to like,
Yeah.
manifest physically the causal chains that we're talking about. But given the like ability to physically manifest the the causal patterns of information relayance, then the substrate does not matter. Um,
okay, I think this before we
yes.
dive into this, I think this relates very interestingly to our previous conversation with Mary's room, where you kept bringing up sort of like the abstract marrying, kind of like
hmm
observing like just pure physical processes, and like whether Mary could ever know whether the system itself was conscious. I I think that
Hmm.
this, in fact, would actually bolster my argument once we'll get into this, that if in fact Mary, you know, could understand the underlying processes and they
Mm,
in fact matched
I see.
perfectly systems that she knew were conscious, then the answer is like yes. Like
Mm, I see.
so
I see.
yeah, but
Okay.
we'll get into this here.
I do. I see where you're taking it. Okay, so this is the this is the crazy thought experiment that we were talking about before that we were alluding to. Okay, this is a thought experiment that Chalmers lays out to support the principle that we just said. So he's basically going to say, okay, imagine for the purposes of setting up a reductio ad absurdum that the principle he just laid out is false, which would mean that there could be two functionally isomorphic systems with different experiences. Okay. So he's going to say
And
basically,
we'll use his example here as well.
yep.
Like
So,
one
yeah,
is a purely silicon based system.
yep.
One is our carbon biological
Neurons, it's
system
meat.
that we're completely aware of at this point. But
Yeah.
functionally they are identical. So
Hmm.
if possible, I mean, like he gets into it and says like,
Yes.
for the purposes of this argument, let's just say that you could in fact produce the exact same physical functionality and then just continue from there. So
Yes, exactly. Um, okay. So the principle is false, and there could be two. Now, yeah, so he's saying, okay, so imagine that this principle is false. And what that means is that imagine that you can have the exact same functional organization, but have different experiences. Now, okay, um, I'm just going to read the. Okay, so now imagine that you've got two systems, A and B. Uh, Let me just read this actually.
yeah,
Okay. For the purposes of illustration, let's say that one system is made up of neurons and the other is made of silicon, and that one experiences red while the other experiences blue. The two systems have the same organization, so we can imagine gradually transforming one into the other, perhaps replacing neurons one at a time by silicon chips with the same logical function. I'm sorry, local function. Um, we thus gain a spectrum of intermediate cases, each with the same organization, but with slightly different physical makeup and slightly different experiences. Pause. So he's saying, okay, imagine that you take the silicone and you're replacing, each meat neuron, each carbon-based neuron with a silicone chip
a
that's
meat
doing
neuron.
the that's doing the exact same logical function that the other's doing. If it's actually substrate dependent, in other words, if the experience depends on what the thing is made out of, you should be changing the experience gradually by replacing um, the carbon neuron with silicone neuron, even though they're firing in the exact same way. Continuing now. We thus gain a spectrum of, no, that was what I just read. Along this spectrum, there must be two systems, A and B, between which we replace less than one-tenth of the system, but whose experiences differ. So he's just saying, okay, we're going to look at two really close parts of the spectrum. These two systems are physically identical, except that a small neural circuit in A has been replaced by a silicon circuit in B. The key step in the thought experiment is to take the relevant neural circuit in A and install alongside it a causally isomorphic silicon circuit with a switch between the two. What happens when we flip the switch? By hypothesis, the system's conscious experiences will change from red to blue, say, for the purposes of illustration. This follows from the fact that the system after the change is essentially a version of B, whereas before the change, it's just A. Okay, so what we've got laid out, I drew a little picture. What we've got laid out is essentially the rest of the system is the same, but you have this little, I guess it would be in parallel for the electrical engineers out there, but you've got like in parallel wired this system where A, or where one side of it is silicone and the other side is meat. But other than that, they are functionally equivalent. those two, and the rest of it's the same. So he's saying flip this back and forth. If it depends on the substrate, the experience should change from reddish to bluish or whatever, right? Then he continues, but given the assumptions, there is no way for the system to notice the changes. Its causal organization stays constant so that all of its functional roles and behavior dispositions stay fixed. As far as the system is concerned, nothing unusual has happened. There is no room for the thought, "Hmm, something strange just happened." In general, the structure of any such thought must be reflected in processing, but the structure of processing remains constant here. If there were if there were to be such a thought, it must float entirely free of the system and would be utterly impotent to affect later processing. Okay, so the way I'm reading that is, okay, let's say if you believe in the substrate dependence, you have to believe that a change in flickering back and forth between A and B would have to change the experience. But if it changes experience, we know from before it has to be available to be like reported. You have to notice that there has to be a change in the system. But the rest of the system is the same. So it can't then manifest like the physical or, yeah, I guess the physical. There's no room for the physical manifestation of that change in awareness to correspond in the rest of the system.
Hmm.
So it cannot be the case that flickering back and forth would create a change in conscious experience because they are organizationally and functionally the same, even though one's meat and one's silicone,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which is I mean, it's a really, really, it's a really, really cool way to make this point. Um, because like the point is actually he's making is so subtle. It's really easy to miss. But I mean, yeah, I mean, he's basically just saying like, okay, you can't like it generates like an internal contradiction almost, to believe otherwise. Um, so he says like we might even flip the switch a number of times back and forth so that experiences of red and blue dance back and forth between the system's inner eye, its experience, in other words. Um, According to the hypothesis, the system can never notice these dancing qualia. And he says, this I take to be a reductio of the original assumption. It is a central fact about experience, very familiar from our own case, that whenever experiences change significantly and we're paying attention, we notice the change. Which is just like it is actually such an understated point, but it's such a cool point. It's like, yeah, okay, if you're focused on something and the thing changes, you are aware of the change. Like you consciously notice the change.
Hmm.
And if we are buying that a change in consciousness has to be related to a change in a change in consciousness has to be um it has to be it has to coincide with a change in awareness. That has to be manifested in the system.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so a change back and forth between identical organizations cannot be, it can't generate a difference in conscious experience if they're laid out functionally the same way. I just think it's a real, I just think,
Yeah,
and you know what's,
and just to repeat this part for Giffin's sake, this is like this is the first time he's really dived into
I was
this,
just gonna
but it
say it's
but
unfair because you and I were able to like think this through before. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And
but
it took
I
us a
like
lot longer the first time.
no way longer, and I think
Way long.
like
I feel like
I
less of a
think
dollar now. Thank you.
no yeah 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 I think like for once it clicks it really clicks, but
It
I think
really clicks.
but I think it's better to take it piece by piece.
Yeah, and it was so funny. Like the experience of reading this thought experiment this time around was so different than the first time. Because like you should have heard like it Adam and I literally had to just like we both had our eyes closed and we were just like okay just like sound and it's like one person just read it like literally sentence by sentence while the other had their eyes closed their hands on their head.
Just hyper
And we
concentrating.
yeah, we just had to like map it out for each other. But this time around, that's why it just clicked a little easier for me is because we had to do that already.
All right. Well,
I
I
mean,
lack that, but I do have like I was trying to like conceptualize it as you were speaking.
mhm.
Um, so I guess do you want to repeat what you had just said? Or
Yeah, so basically like I'll put it in my own words.
yeah, yeah,
Okay, so here's the thought experiment. Okay, so the principle that he's trying to prove is that what matters for conscious experience is how the system is laid out, not what it's made up of, right?
yeah,
Okay, so he's saying, here's how I'm going to support that. Okay, so he's saying, like, imagine it was the other way around, and imagine that what really mattered was what the system was made out of, not how it was organized. I'm going to show that that is incoherent
yeah,
through the following thought experiment. Here's the thought experiment. Imagine you have this big system. Let's just say that the entire system is a silicone based one.
yeah,
And what we're going to do is we're going to crop out this little this 5% of the system makes up this little network. We're going to move that off to the side and we're going to wire in parallel, like I kind of had this little
yeah.
diagram.
Separated by a switch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we're going to make it functionally an exact copy of
Yes.
that, but we're just going to do it in meat, in like carbon based we're
I love
doing carbon
I love that expression.
in meat. It just it
No,
makes it so
no,
visceral. Okay,
no. It does. I think I understand like the foundational
yeah.
attributes of the
So,
thought experiment.
okay. So we're going to just have a switch that toggles the flow of the system through one or the other.
Yeah.
Now, if we're supposing that what matters for the experience of the system is what it's made out of, let's say that meat tends toward blue and the silicone is red, right? The difference in those is what's creating the experience of red versus blue. If you toggle that switch back and forth, you should, from the conscious, experience of the system, it should be creating a red experience versus a blue one, right? If what matters is what the system is made out of,
Yes.
okay? But if that was happening, if you were the system and you were toggling back and forth and it was switching red, blue, you'd be aware of that change, right?
Yes.
And if you're aware of that change, that awareness has to be manifest in some part of the system.
Right.
But the rest of the system is unchanged. So where can that, so it's a change in conscious experience, which has to
Yes.
relate to a change in awareness. And if
Yes.
it's a change in awareness, it's a change in this system's awareness. So it has to be changing somewhere. But the rest of the system is the same.
Yeah.
All
Pause.
you're doing is,
Yeah,
yeah,
pause on this one. So Giffin, you agree with the entity that is experiencing, would they be able to discern between the two experiences? Do you agree they wouldn't be able to?
That is my inclination, yeah.
Okay. Right now, your experience could be changing dramatically from second to second, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, given that you just
if
accepted
this was true.
if that was true.
Hmm.
Because I mean, it would, if from the whoever that person is, from their experience, if they can't tell the difference, if there is no
If it's red
kind
versus
of,
blue, and it just all is the same to them.
yeah, then like
Mhm.
from second to second, like if functionally everything stayed the same way in your brain right now, you would have no way to discern between radical conscious changes,
Yes.
and that doesn't sound right, right?
Yeah.
That you're
So
completely
yeah,
ungrounded. Your conscious experience is ungrounded it's unconstrained by the way that your brain or what the systems, it doesn't matter how it's organized. The conscious experience can be completely disconnected from that. And that does not at all seem to be our experience of the world. So it would go
We wouldn't
completely
know.
against.
We wouldn't know. I mean, like there
Yeah.
seems to be from every second of my conscious
Yes.
experience right now.
Yes.
But this paper is saying, well, you know, given that thought experiment, it could radically be changing from second to second right now, and you can't even percebe the difference.
Yeah. Which doesn't.
And
It's
so
just. It's
and
so
it's such an
implausible.
absurd
Like,
concept that it's
yes.
like, well, given the setup here, probably there is a substrate independence,
Mm.
that Chalmers is speaking to. What do you think? Whenever you hear that, what is because there might be an issue with our retelling of it.
You're asking me?
Yes.
Okay, so trying to organize my thoughts. I I think it's if I understand the thought experiment, um, I think it is a good one. It does seem absurd the result of like that separation. I if it's do you think it's helpful, I will describe how I was thinking about it.
Sure, sure.
So one thing that like I was trying to grapple with, I think, was separating like so like yeah, take for granted you got like on the one hand like silicon, and then you got at the other hand like neurons or whatever meat. um, I think what I like in like reading this and like again like just kind of just now after having read the third part, I was
Mm.
starting to wonder whether the silicon might like conceptually like produce a like different experience because of like the fundamental property of like silicon. But I think I what I realized is like if that is the case, then it's not functionally identical, right? That's the
It's not
fundamental
Yes.
functionally.
principle.
Yes, yes. We
Yes.
could write
That's
the
Right.
physical, like
yeah.
physically identical in the
Yeah.
functions.
Yes.
So
So
Yeah.
you need like the organizational principles, and to the extent that you think that silicon and neurons might not, that's just demonstrating non-functional identity.
Mm.
Identical.
Hmm.
They're not functionally identical. Okay. So I think I got that. Yeah, I think I grasp it. And I
It is
right
one of
like
those like it's one of those like classic thought. There's so many of these where like when you've got it in hand, it's so in hand, but if you let it go for a second, it can like really like escape you.
yeah,
I think that's fair descriptor. I think I get it. Like I think I got it, and I think I like endorse the kind of view that like is substrate dependence the theory that he lands on, or like
No,
the thought.
independence,
independence. Yeah,
independence.
he's
Yeah,
trying to support substrate independence.
Oh, where subs. Okay, so where substrate is like it can
Yes.
be different elements, but assuming it's the same function. Okay, yeah. So yeah, no,
yes,
Yes.
I
yes.
endorse that
Yes.
principle. Okay, yeah,
Yeah. And
no,
that's where it's like a little complicated because he is saying like, okay, assume the opposite is true and assume it does depend on the substrate.
yes. Then
That
it becomes
generates a
absurd.
reductio, which then popping back out a level supports substrate independence.
Yes. Okay. No, I think I'm
Yeah.
on board, honestly. Like, I don't think I have any like notes here, and I think it makes sense. I
Yeah.
think the only thing that was like tripping me up in like rereading this, like, together was like my memory of the third prong, like, the basic principle where I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, well, if we're trying to integrate, like, interface that with this, like, how does that work? But again, if you focus on
But
the
I
kind
think,
of
yeah,
functionally identical, and I'll share like this other
yes.
thing that like I don't know why this is like how what I was trying to think of, but have you guys ever seen like almost absurd? Have you ever seen like redstone calculators in Minecraft?
Yes, yes, I know
Yeah.
exactly
Okay,
what you're
Jordan,
talking
thank you.
about.
I'm so glad you said that.
It's
Whereas like
actually such
that,
a good analogy.
okay, thank you. I thought I was going
It-
insane. I'm just sitting here. I'm like, is this absolutely insane what I'm about
It's
to say?
actually such a good analogy because it's like it's a probably good cut, but like the argument is basically like okay, if like you set up that whole like mining system or whatever, and like all the information's flowing through like the redstone, if you had some equivalent way of translating the information, but it just wasn't redstone, like everything would stay the same in the
Yeah,
system
like
essentially.
ropes and pulleys as an alternative, or like the kind
Yeah.
of electronic like I don't know gate switches and like representing Boolean, like whatever
Hmm.
that like organization relationship is the key, not whether it's
Yes.
made of like
Redstone or
sand and
whatever.
redstone
Yes.
or
Yeah.
okay,
No, yeah,
okay,
it's
that
exactly about that. Yeah.
okay, then I'm 100%
And
on board at this point.
and this is all like because at the end of the day, like this is all kind of like a conditional claim, as he specifies later, where it's like, okay, if the organization can be made the same,
Right.
you know, in
Yes.
silicone as we see in carbon-based neural
Yes.
networks. It might be the case that that's not possible, but that wouldn't affect this principle because this is
Yes.
all saying like if this is possible, then it's about the organization, not about the substrate.
And
Okay.
let me add this too, like because I'll make one last
It's
stab at trying to like because this is kind of like the way I view the thought experiment, which is like you're given the thought experiment between the neurons and the silicon, and then he kind of lays out the flipping of the switch back and forth between the experiences, from like green to red, red to blue, that kind of idea. And it's like, okay, well, if they're functionally identical, then the system has no way of identifying there's been sort of any sort of experiential change. And when I get to that part, I think like, okay, like fine, like I what's wrong with that? I mean, that seems like certainly plausible, but then it's like, okay, but if you step out a level, then how are you to say if the functional, state of your brain stays the exact same and your conscious experience rapidly changes from second to second? How are you to notice the difference? And it's like
mm,
that's like the like where it impresses upon me
yes,
like the
yes,
true absurdity of it at that point, where it's
yeah,
just like to describe a system that stays functionally constant with a radically different experience
just the
that
dancing
you then
quality.
map to your own, like exactly. It's just
Yeah.
like it's like you do reach, like, as he kind of goes in the next page, he says like this hypothesis has the same status as the possibility that the world was created 5 minutes ago. Like perhaps it is logically coherent, but it is not plausible. I'm not even
Mhm.
sure like the not plausible part, but it's just
It's like
absurd.
it's
It's
just
just like
absurd. Yes.
it's absurd. Like it's like, yeah, could
Well,
the
and
world have been
also,
created 5 minutes ago? Like yes, of course, but like it's
yeah,
absurd. Like to
Yeah.
entertain that idea in the
yes.
same way that it's like absurd to entertain that, like, you know, functionally my brain is the exact same, and I don't notice radical differences
Hmm.
from second to second in conscious experience. Like that it's
I,
absurd.
I'm glad you
So
pressed upon that a little bit further.
Hmm.
does the absurdity strike you a little more like with
Yes.
that? Like it's
Yeah.
absurd. Like so it's not
Eh,
logically incoherent, but it's absurd. So
Yeah,
like
it's just absurd. And I think the other implicit point that he's kind of like working with here is like not only is it absurd, but also we're done. Like there is no like if that is possible, first of all, it is absurd. But second of all, there's nowhere to go from there. Like you're just the science of consciousness is done at that point. Like that then it's just like that is kind of I mean that is bordering on like you have to believe something supernatural at that point. Like I think that maybe that's actually where this is also I'm seeing the naturalistic dualism show up a lot here, and I don't think I made that connection before, where like yeah, the possibility that the world was created 5 minutes ago is like, is it logically possible? Yeah, but does that require something supernatural given, kind of like the current state of the world? Yeah, it kind of would. You know what I mean? And then if that's on the table, well then, if like the
Yeah.
world can be created 5 minutes ago, then all bets are off for
That's a
kind of
hundred
draw.
percent. Yeah, this like
Yeah.
this does feel like time back to our earlier conversation, like kind of interfacing with sort of like a religious framing. Because if you kind of buy that God could have just like snapped things into existence, like moments before, like the Earth is actually only 4,000 years old, and the dinosaur bones were put there,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
like
Sure,
it might
is it
be.
logically inconsistent? Like it's possible. It's of course, you know what I mean? It's like
I won't be entertaining it any further, but
exactly. And I didn't make that connection before the first time Adam and I talked about this, but I this is where I really see like a
the
lot of
natural.
and the differentiation from like supernatural dualism coming in here.
yeah, it's like, is
I'm
Which
it
glad you.
possible
Yeah,
there's no, functional grounding to conscious experience? Like it's like, yeah, I
yeah.
mean, I guess, but at the same time,
Mhm.
like it just leads to absolute madness. So
Yeah. Yeah,
so
it's
we
madness.
probably should not operate that as like, it's like I mean,
Yeah.
we don't do that in any of our sciences where it's
Hmm.
just like, there's what is it, uh poor sleep last night. We'll just continue. So
I was gonna say, I want to get through the third one.
yes.
because this is it's cognitively taxing to talk about this sort of
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it
Okay,
would be good if I'm going to be taking the lead, that we read at least two paragraphs just to kind of like set the stage before we get
just
into
to
it, rather than
Fine by
just
yeah,
me.
like,
yeah,
you know.
yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So the two preceding principles have been non-basic principles. They involve high-level notions such as awareness and organization, and therefore lie at the wrong level to constitute the fundamental laws in a theory of consciousness. Nevertheless, they act as strong constraints. What is further needed are basic principles that fit these constraints and that might ultimately explain them. The basic principle that I suggest centrally involves the notion of information. I understand information in more or less the sense of Shannon 1948. Where there is information, there are information states embedded in an information space. Any information space has a basic structure of difference relations between its elements, characterizing the ways in which different elements in a space are similar or different, possibly in complex ways. An information space is an abstract object, but following Shannon, we can see information is physically embodied when there is a space of distinct physical states. The differences between them can be transmitted down some causal pathway. The states that are transmitted can be seen as themselves constituting an information space. Okay, so that's a really, really important line. Let me read that again for clarity. The states that are transmitted can be seen as themselves constituting an information space. To borrow a phrase from Bateson, physical information is a difference that makes a difference. Okay. All right. So, at least on some high level, I can immediately agree with this, right? Which is just like kind
I'm
of
sorry.
the
It can or can't. You
can,
they'll be able
can,
to
and
can. Okay.
so yeah, yeah. So I think maybe as like a first question, like, does it seem reasonable that information in any sort of depiction must constitute some difference between elements?
Yes. Even as something like the example that came to my mind was something as basic as like binary, where it's just the difference between 0 and 1.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't,
like
Is
I
not.
can't understand like how you would convey information without there just being like the yes or no, 0 versus 1. Like yes, I completely agree that like it seems incoherent to convey information without there being a difference between like the possible states.
yeah, yeah. I think that just seems like self-evident. You can't have something that's entirely like homogeneous and yet there's something to be conveyed from it,
Yes, I
you
agree.
know?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
certainly my intuition at least.
Yeah.
Only
So
you could grasp it.
what'd you say?
I just said like if only you were brighter, then you could see like even homogeneity, even the
Truly
homogeneity.
though.
Yeah.
If only. But no, I mean I have no qualms with that so far. That's
I
just
agree.
describing information, not like the actual dual aspect theory.
Yes,
So
yeah.
so the
Yeah,
second
because
part,
it's like
Adam.
yeah, because you
Oh,
can imagine like even like the most absurd, almost like some sort of like semi-Rothko painting, which is like, obviously his paintings were more complex than this, but you can imagine just like infinite redness, just like, kind of observing something like that. But it means nothing except in its kind of juxtaposition to something else.
There has to be a different, even shade of red somewhere for there to be information conveyed. Yeah.
Yes. Like, or like, past experiences, like even if I was placed like in an infinite
Mhm.
void of red, it's just like, well, that actually there is some information to that, given that I have kind of like this cognitive load of past experiences that I can juxtapose it to.
but
So
only given that.
Yes, only given that. Like if you were like a being who was like conceived in the redness, you would never experienced anything outside just like the infinite redness. I mean, there could be no information conveyed without there being a difference. Like if it was
About the
just
space, yeah.
yeah, like it was just like unending and unperturbed redness.
But like it gets even worse than that when like you take the next step, which is like, okay, you have to imagine like, okay, even in your circumstance, maybe there is still like the physical embodiment of the person. So therefore, like there is
Sure.
the interaction of like, like wavelengths interacting with like the physiology of the person. And therefore there's where the difference actually arises.
If they
Like
can blink, then they can conceptualize a difference
Sure, I would, yeah,
exactly,
between like
it's
exactly.
just
strong red
statically.
and not strong red.
But you can also
I
imagine just like it's like in fact like there is just infinite red and like what is in the president's like the presence to almost like observe infinite red? Well, it's infinite red. You know what I mean? Like that that is what is like, in the presence of infinite red. And it's like there's no
yes.
difference. There's no information there. Like
Yeah, I like Jordan's abstract torture chamber of
The
yeah.
clockwork
born with
orange.
Yeah.
no eyelids. But no,
Yeah.
I think we're all on board, right, with like information and like its basic print, uh, the basic structure of different relations, right? All on
Yeah.
board. Okay,
Yeah.
excellent.
Okay. I'm gonna keep going then because I think
Yeah,
it's
please.
better to get more to further observers.
Yeah.
So the double aspect principle stems from the observation that there is a direct isomorphism between certain physically embodied information states and certain phenomenal information states. From the same sort of observations that went into the principle of structural coherence, we can note that the differences between phenomenal states have a structure that corresponds directly to the differences embedded in physical processes. Okay, we all agree on that. In particular, to those differences that make a difference down certain causal pathways implicated in global availability and control. I think we all agree on that. Let me read that again.
Mhm.
So, let's see where to read from. In particular, to those differences that make a difference down certain causal pathways implicated in global availability and control. Okay, I think so. Where it's just
Yeah,
like,
because this was just from my understanding, right? Like he's
hmm,
saying, okay, if you buy the previous principle, um, wait, I'm sorry.
no,
Principle.
you're on the right track there. Like right
Yeah.
above it, he says like from the same
Well,
sort of
From the
observations that went into
this
the
is
principle of structural coherence,
yes.
we can
yes,
note the
which is actually the
differences.
first one. I'm sorry, it's the first
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
the
But
way
like
I said it made it seem like it was the second.
it's as
Uh,
simple as like, okay, we can know the differences between phenomenal states have a structure that corresponds directly to the differences embedded in physical processes. So like,
yes, yes, which we agree on.
so it's like
Um,
in particular, not just, the physical processes, but more specifically to those differences that make a difference down certain causal pathways. So
mhm.
it's like it's not just states, physical states as much. It's like specifically differences down certain causal pathways.
Yeah,
So
yeah, the differences that are relevant in that causal chain. Yes.
exactly, because it's like there, you know, can be differences that could be, construed as differences in information, but we're talking about a certain relevant information here. So
Yes. And then he puts the bow on it, which now makes even more sense after we've discussed it. That is, we can find the same abstract information space embedded in physical processing and in conscious experience. So if I'm going to translate that, basically, it's like, okay, the same abstract information space, like the space in which differences show up, that's going to be embedded both in the physical processing and in the associated like experience of being exposed to that thing. The difference that
yeah,
makes a difference is going to show up both in the thing and in the experience associated with it.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, so
Which,
here's where it gets tricky. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say, like, even spelling it out in those terms, I mean, the plausibility is quite high so far.
Yeah, I agree
Like,
with all that.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so the
I mean,
principle itself then.
yeah. So this leads to a natural hypothesis that information, or at least some information, has two basic aspects. a physical aspect, and a phenomenal aspect. This has the status of a basic principle that might underlie and explain the emergence of experience from the physical. Experiences Experience arises by virtue of its status as one aspect of information, when the other aspect is found embodied in physical processing. So I'll tell you from like where we're at right now on the page, that doesn't seem evident to me. So
Yeah, experiences arise by virtue of its status as one aspect of information when the other aspect is found in. Okay, when you read the first sentence, I had a question, kind of a skeptical question. Let me just reread the. This leads to a natural hypothesis that information, or at least some information, has two basic aspects: a physical aspect and a phenomenal aspect. Myth. I don't think this is going back on anything we've previously agreed upon. But like, okay, why do the two aspects have to be located in information
That my
as
exact question.
opposed, yeah, as opposed to almost kind of what I thought the conclusion of the previous paragraph was, which is just that saying that like, okay, information just if it's going to show up in one space and that space is connected with conscious experience, then that differential which constitutes the information space, shows up in both. That seems like it's actually different than saying that information itself has two basic aspects, right?
can you repeat that again? I didn't
Such an
follow your
ill-formed
last
thought.
part.
It's such
No,
an ill.
it's valuable actually. I want to pick it over.
Okay, my reaction to this is like, okay, the the first sentence of the paragraph is this leads to a natural hypothesis that information, or at least some information, has two basic aspects, a physical aspect and a phenomenal aspect. Sounds like what he's saying is like, okay, the these are aspects of information itself, like they are the information itself has these two aspects. Whereas before, it seemed like all he was saying is just that, he says, okay, in particular, to those differences that make a difference down certain causal pathways implicated in global availability and control, i.e., awareness. That is, we can find the same abstract information space embedded in physical processing and in conscious experience. That seems like the different aspects are not in the information. The different aspects are in the systems that are being affected by or where the information itself is showing up in. The information is showing up in the physical system because it's creating the change in awareness, and it's showing up in the conscious system because it's like the losing my train of thought a little bit, but like both are keying in on the same information. And in that sense, it doesn't seem like the information has two aspects. It seems like both the physical and the experiential are keying in on the same difference in information. Does
Yeah,
that does
no,
that make sense?
yeah. Let me see if I can say something that's
Yeah, sharpen it
analogous.
up.
So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I can do that, but like the way I'm looking at it is like the first paragraph of the top is kind of like using information, like the concept of information, to
Hmm.
kind of like assess, like assess what we like know as like a tool to like explain like kind of physical processes in the relation to conscious experience. The second paragraph seems to take the foundation instead of like using information as a tool, like information is now like the foundation of like the consciousness, right? Like it's transforming information from a tool to like for us to understand to it being something material out of which it seems like I don't know the physical and phenomenal emerge almost. And then there, I don't know. I see. I don't know if that sharpened it or dulled it, but like I do see like some like gap. Like there's a gap between the end of like that first paragraph and the beginning of that second.
I agree. And whether that
I want to
is
circle back
stylistic.
around to where he's defining information again.
Hmm.
So so
Oh,
where there is information, there are information states embedded in information space. An information space has a basic structure of difference relations between its elements, characterizing the ways in which different elements in a space are different or similar or different. So,
Can I pause and ask a quick question?
mhm,
Do these differences, this has to be physically embedded or like physically instantiated, right? Like
yeah, yeah.
because that's the whole point is like there has to be a difference. So, okay, continue.
So, I want to make sure we understand this sentence really well because it says an information space has a basic structure of difference relations between its elements, characterizing the ways in which different elements in a space are similar or different. So with that, like, is the information space not just like the information contents, almost like because I almost go back to chemistry in a sense where it's like you can imagine that I don't know. Let's Giffen, you and I are both pretty similar with like proteins, for example.
okay.
Like a protein, like depending on a certain molecule that has interacted with the protein itself can now change shape, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And can open up other sites that allow for different interactions. So like let's use that as an example, just kind of for our thinking right now, which is
Sure,
just
yeah.
that like
So what like the question is like what difference relations can we derive like from this protein hypo?
yeah, and is it also like the entire like do we have to step out and kind of like take a look at like the system's interaction with the protein specifically to kind of get a sense of like what actual information
Well,
is okay, go ahead.
no, no. Here's, I mean, I'm just gonna spitball and hopefully we can together come to something sharp. But what I'm imagining is like if trying to describe like information embedded in like a protein of a certain structure, like the natural one for me to think about first is like location, right? Like there is a distance between each like atom, let's just say atom, um, that comprises like, the greater protein. Or if we want to look at it a little bit more macro level, like each amino acid, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you can describe like differences in like their like spatial location and the
Yeah.
actual location of the matter, it's just like the difference that matters. So that's like some information you can derive. And like because you can conceptualize one a folding of like a protein, you can differentiate one folding of a protein from another folding of a protein using that like information of like the distance of its constituent parts. Is that like a way that you're imagining we use information here?
I think that's part of it. I'm
Okay.
just wondering if
There's more.
but I'm wondering if you described in a lot of ways like protein at time equals zero, and this is now protein at time equals one, depending on like how it's interacted with the environment. Like my question is a narrow look at the state of the protein enough to say that that itself is information, or is it only information with respect to its
Two.
environment at the time? Like how do we have to kind of zoom out a
Yeah.
little bit?
So I guess to your point about time one, time zero, if we just looked at like a single frozen in time protein, I think you could still derive information from it without referencing like the external, and like the information would still be kind of just like the location of like the parts relative to one another. Like is that information, I guess?
I
It
It's
is,
information to us, but I wonder like information like because we can conceptualize the difference obviously in the protein depending on like has it been binding obviously hit like there's a three-dimensionality to the protein and with that like comes a lot of movement within like the protein itself like as like bonds vibrate and whatnot so so I understand like the protein is constantly changing but like what I'm interested to know is like not what is information to us conceptually, but like what is information on its own, like outside the observer, in a sense. You know what I mean? Like, um, if that makes any sense.
I mean,
Like,
I guess I thought I was describing something that was without respect to the observer. Like, but now I'm not sure if I fully understand what the difference is. Because like I whenever am describing, like, I'm not talking about like the greater things that relate to that like structure, like its ability to like bond with other proteins or whatever. Um, like
Is
just like
your
looking at a physical structure and like assessing like, okay, there exists like a carbon atom there, a nitrogen atom there, and like I know that like this one is here, compared to this one, like a distance x, and that you can sum up all of the different atoms like locations relative to one another, and like you have information from that. And that is that like still not intrinsic information, or is that information from like our perspective?
I I think you're right. I think you're right. There is intrinsic information as Chalmers is describing. Let me read this section again right here, which is
Yeah.
maybe a look at the protein as you're describing it. That's like the protein. We can kind of put like the bounds around the protein itself and say that that's an information space because there are difference relations between its elements,
Yeah.
right? Like
And
as
we've
you
been talking
described
about like
before, like
physical location, but you could also do the same thing with like charge, like
or
perhaps.
mm,
carbon versus nitrogen as you just brought
Oh
up.
yeah, yeah.
Like that, like that that's super clear too. Like so, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean like there are differences in
Yeah.
that space right there. Okay, so would he constitute that as now information? Like there
That
is
sounds like different
information.
relations to me. I mean, right? Jordan, do you have
So,
any
but I'm
thoughts? Are we losing you?
no, I do have thoughts. I had started kind of mentally having a conversation with myself where I was trying to translate this question into like the most basic possible version of the question, but I want to ask if it is still the same question. Because I was thinking like, okay, is the following another instance of this same question you're asking? Just in terms of going back to binary to try to simplify it as most I can, is the presence of like just a zero on its own, does that constitute information? Or does it have to be like, do you have to know it? So the information space, it's possible for it to be zero or one. So does a single zero or a single one constitute information on its own? Because while there's not a difference within the zero or one, it's just a zero or a one, there is a difference in the information space because it could be a zero or a one. Like, is that the
I
most
think you're right. I think you're
That
what?
right.
makes sense.
I think you're right about that. Yeah, yeah. Because I
So an information space is just a possibility of difference. And the single smallest unit of information within that space is going to be the smallest unit of difference possible.
So a zero within the information space of zero or one. So
Yes,
like the
or a
zero
one,
itself lonely is information because in the context of the information
because of the
space,
information
it is a
space.
difference from what it could be.
Does
I
that
mean,
seem
so that seems
correct?
that seems right to my understanding of information, but I don't know how that gloms on to like the second paragraph that we were kind of like
Yeah.
like it. Can we say that that's zero? Oh,
Well,
it
here's
does grant some information, but it's hard for me to imagine a physical and a phenomenal aspect to like
that I
from
completely agree with you.
information.
Okay, here's this like, okay, let me read this one transitionary sentence. This is at the very bottom of 22 going into 23. He says the double aspect principle stems from the observation that there is a direct isomorphism between certain physically embodied information spaces and certain phenomenal or experiential information spaces. So I'm just trying to map that onto like what I was just saying, where like, okay, like the information space is like the possibility of difference. What does this mean? Like, okay, there's an isomorphism between certain
This
between
is like
certain
maddening. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
okay, the So the double aspect principle, it stems from the observation that there is a direct isomorphism between certain physically embodied information spaces. So a switch that can be zero or one, and certain phenomenal or experiential information spaces. A a phenomenal switch that can be zero or one. You can have light or dark or something like that, right? Um, from the same sort of observations that went into the principle of structural coherence, we can note that the differences between phenomenal states have a structure that corresponds directly to the differences embedded in physical processes. Just pause for a second there. We can note that the differences between phenomenal states have a structure. So it's about the structure that corresponds directly to the differences embedded in physical processes. Is he the differences between phenomenal states have a structure that corresponds? God.
Adam, do you have any insight here?
I've kind of gone back to 22 because I'm really trying to think about with Jordan's kind of reconceptualization of what exactly like a space is. I'm
Yeah.
trying to kind of map that back onto what he said here, which is that we can see information as physically embodied when there is a space of distinct physical states, the differences between which can be transmitted down some causal pathway. So that kind of
Yeah.
goes back to the functionality we just brought up, which is like, okay, like these differences need to pretty much like enter into some sort of causation.
Mhm.
Like they can't just exist in some abstract like space that has no causality.
So
Mhm.
thinking about this in the context of the protein we were discussing earlier, that is um physically embodied because there are distinct physical states, and you know um it can be transmitted down a causal pathway. In this context, like a protein might be involved in any number of biological processes, right?
Sure, sure. The states that are transmitted can be seen as themselves constituting an information space. So it's almost like there are kind of nested information spaces in a sense, where it's like you can look at the individual protein as Giffin and I were earlier, and
Mhm.
like kind of describe like an information space for the protein, but then also describe like information spaces depending on like the entire chain of causality there.
And I think like that sentence, if I'm reading it correctly, I think illustrates like my thought behind the states that are transmitted can be seen themselves as constituting an information space in the sense that they could have been different. So like what I was saying before, where like even a zero, while there's no difference in that information state, it itself constitutes an information space because it could have been a one. Did, does that seem like an accurate reading of that sentence?
Think so, but I think he's trying to go beyond that. I don't think it's just information that gets transmitted down some causal chain that
Hmm.
constitutes the information space. Like I think it's the
It's
entire
the
chain of
space
causation.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Damn, we should have read Shannon 1948. Jesus.
yeah.
There's some leap that's going on,
No, I feel the leap. I do.
but it's like I don't know if it's just like a leap in my understanding or if it's like a leap in the logic. You
So
know what I
here,
mean?
yeah, no, 100%. So here's my question. I don't know if this gets us any further or not. We can
Yeah.
ignore it, but so like that like example of like information um kind of relates to uh this example that's like given in like the second to last paragraph of page 22.
Hmm.
I feel like it's easy for me to map that onto like the protein hypo because it's talking about physical information, right?
Okay.
I do we what is the analog experience phenomenal information space? Like, can we describe it with attributes in the same way? Like, is there another part that we can pull from this paper? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I can describe like, the difference between the like, carbon or the nitrogen. I'm not sure if like, and if we can get like some analog there from the phenomenal side of like information spaces, it seems like a lot harder to grapple with. Do you know what I mean?
I just think like you could like really zoom out though, because like this whole information state and information space, um, it it could be applied at so many different levels. You know what I mean? Where it's just like, okay, we could talk about the interactions between elements themselves, and we could also talk about, the interactions between neurons. You
Hmm.
know, like you could imagine in a very complex system, obviously, which is he's alluding to our own brains, but like there's an information space of all the different types of ways like neurons themselves could be interacting.
I
So it's like,
100% understand that to the extent that it describes like the physical brain. Like
yeah,
I can imagine what it means for there to be an information space represented by the brain and its pathways. Like that makes sense to me. I don't know that I have any understanding, like looking at this again, of what like an information space for like a phenomenal information space, how to describe that. Did was that like
I'm
this?
gonna can I venture like a thought?
Please, please, please. Can't be any less mad than what I'm thinking.
Well, no, I'm wondering if like, but I'm wondering if like the madness kind of makes sense to your thought there because it's like it's actually very, very, very difficult or like maybe impossible to actually conceptualize like a singular phenomenal information state because not like nothing comes into our phenomenal like awareness that way.
Yeah,
Like
very
it would
true.
be like it is it's like because I think what Adam was saying makes sense where it's like okay phenomenally there are just like so many dimensions to all of this going on where it's like just like the brightness of something is going to be like one dimension like the color the hue the saturation like is going to be another but then it kind of losing my train of thought a little bit but it is like the information space is going to be translated as the like a difference in like the quality of the experience. Is that right? Like,
So hue is like can be
mhm.
described within an information, like information state within an information space, right? Like
Yeah,
red is the information, or sorry, red is the phenomenal, or the experience of red is the phenomenal information state within the hue phenomenal information space. Is that?
something like that. Yeah,
So I can distinguish between a redness experience and a non-redness experience. So that would qualify.
yeah, or even like, or even you just get to even like, yeah, it's just as basic as like brightness experience versus like just non-brightness. Like,
No, I'm glad you like brought Pew back up because I needed something to latch onto, and our discussions have like thrown what I was latching onto to the winds.
that's just like, oh, I do feel like I'm being like pushed to the endurance of my brain in some sense here. Like,
well, I think we just haven't. I don't think he's laid out as of yet, like why information necessarily leads to experience. I think it's just right now
yeah,
just a conceptualization of what is information. Like I think we're like 80% of the way there
yeah,
on at least how you can conceptualize information spaces and states. Because
iteration.
I think we all agree that like yeah, like if the physically embodied information changes, we expect there to be a corresponding
Yeah.
experiential change. And there's
Hmm.
probably a lot of granularity in both, right? It's like we
Yeah.
expect billions of neurons. And as you were describing before, like pinpointing the exact experience is like impossible because there's like, with all the different combinations,
There's
practically
always a
infinite.
flood.
You know,
Yes,
like
always a
practic
flood. Yes,
practically infinite. Like I don't know what the upper bound
yes,
is,
Right.
but probably like we're
yes.
talking about, I would love for us to maybe read up more on some of like
Mm.
the information papers that have kind of like undergirded this section here, because like um it's very tough to talk about like when we haven't like read the literature
I
that
know, yeah.
so
Do we want to, here's what we could do is we could do one of two things. We could begin the next recording with just a brief, like, finishing of this.
I think
Because
we should. I think we
it's
Yeah.
should.
literally just this and that, and then I can decide whether I take that recording and tack it on to the end of this one, or if we actually just decide to like make it a two-parter in a sense.
No, I think what we should do is um we get a new paper for the next reading,
Yeah.
and then we all just further read up on this last bit right here. Only this last bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because
no, I agree. It's
because I
literally this paragraph and pretty much the next paragraph. That's it. It's literally two paragraphs. Yeah.
because I think there's more definitions and more. I want to watch some videos on like why does he think this? Like why
The problem is that he's actually making massive moves in the span of like 2 pages, and I don't have anywhere close to the expertise to understand like what he's talking about, let alone like track the argument going on
yeah,
here.
yeah. I just think this is one of the most important papers ever in the theory of mind conversation. So
Yes,
I
It's
think
worth digging into more.
it's worth
yes,
setting aside the next part of our podcast to
I
discuss this with
agree.
you. So
All right.
I agree. I
I'm down
agree.
for that.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
so
I'm sorry to cut it short. Today has been kind
no,
of
I also didn't expect it to actually go this long either, because
yeah.
I kind of thought I had. I mean, this was a classic experience of like, kind of think you've got the paper in hand, like rereading it yourself,
Yeah, yeah.
and then you actually discuss, and you're like,
Yep.
okay, like this is crazy. What's going on here?
Yeah.
Actually, in interrogating this one sentence, all of what I thought I knew is now dust.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
All right, guys. I
No
do have to hop
worries.
off right now, though. But
okay, sounds
we
good.
will chat again in a week for sure.
Sounds
Yeah,
So
for
good. We'll
sure.
discuss offline.
Yeah, for
excellent,
sure.
See ya
Talk
for
to you
now.
later.
See ya.
I've started a new Instagram. You can find that by searching for the user name is Plato's Cave Podcast. That's all one word, no apostrophe in Plato's. You can find me as you could before on Twitter or X at Jordan_C_Myers. And my website, jordanmyers.org, is going to be updated shortly. It's a good way to sort of, I guess, either get in touch with me, you can contact me through there, or it's also a place that I'm going to trying to use to upload sort of recent work of mine that I'm in the process of developing.